G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection for race week 3 ahead of the Australian Grand Prix. So if you're new around here, please do drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So before we get into how my team is shaping up for Australia, we're going to take a quick look at how it performed in Saudi Arabia. I had 161 points all out. And Max and the Red Bull constructor, as was the case in Bahrain, continued to shoulder the bulk of the point scoring burden. Funnily enough, Max and Red Bull had 162 points between the two of them, and the team finished on 161 points. So it goes to show how dreadful of a race weekend it was, and I would have been better off running just those two and not having the other 5 slots filled. But it is what it is, and that's how the cookie crumbles. A lot of that really boiled down to the fact that Lance Stroll didn't even get to the end of the race. It's his second visit to Saudi Arabia where he hasn't made it to the checkered flag. And at a circuit like Saudi Arabia, which is not forgiving at all, extremely high speed sections on the track, if you're going to make mistakes, which Lance Stroll can be prone to, it's not going to be very forgiving at all. And unfortunately, he was the second victim in the Grand Prix. Gasly didn't even make it through 2 laps before he was asked to retire the car. But unfortunately, that was a mechanical issue and not related to his performance on track. Stroll, however, just seemed to be unlucky there. And for the Aston Martin constructor owners and for Lance Stroll owners, a -20 is not a pretty sight to see, despite the fact he actually did qualify quite well and also made a couple of passes on track. So he had all the makings of a sound result heading into the Grand Prix, and that pace, that Aston Martin pace, actually looked pretty respectable. Like, they definitely are in the top 5 teams. I don't think there's really anyone further back in the midfield that's going to rival Aston Martin or any of the other teams above them. So I was expecting a points finish from Lance Stroll, especially because of the fact that Sainz was out. But the drive from Ollie Bearman, who started P11 on the grid and finished in P7 and the driver of the day, was essentially the story of the weekend. A phenomenal drive from the rookie who deputized for Carlos Sainz, who was unable to participate because of that appendicitis. So for those people that did take a punt on Ollie Bearman, they were handsomely rewarded. He came away with 26 points and that driver of the day nomination. So a really mature drive from someone 18 years old. Just, we weren't really sure what to expect. If he was able to get the car to the end of the race, that would have been a pretty respectable accomplishment. But the fact he was able to get a P7 in his debut just goes to show the caliber of the driver he is and has such a mature head on his shoulders. So I'm really excited for Ollie Bearman, what the future holds for him. He's obviously driven practice sessions with the Haas in 2023, and Io Komatsu has really spoken highly of Bearman as a driver to watch heading into next year and beyond. So really great drive from him, and there's speculation that Sainz may not return in time for the Australian Grand Prix. Appendicitis can take anywhere between 2 and 6 weeks to recover from post-surgery. So if it looks like within 7 days of the race kicking off that Sainz is not going to be ready for Australia, Bearman could again run it back with Ferrari. And at that price, I think he's sitting at around 15 million with that $1 million increase. Could be a very attractive option, and we'll get into that in a minute. But notwithstanding that, a brilliant result for Bearman and Ferrari in Saudi Arabia. In terms of the rest of my team, pretty much a dog's breakfast across the board. Magnussen, 7 points I didn't think was actually what was representative of his drive. He did an incredible job to hold up a quarter of the field on that DRS train in a Haas that has a much improved race pace, and I think part of that meant he was able to do and have the drive he did, and ultimately contributed to Hülkenberg's P10 and that 1 point for Haas that puts them up to P6 in the constructors. So a solid result for Haas and a great drive from Magnussen. 7 points, although probably not, again, anything crash hot. It just goes to show that they aren't losing positions, multiple positions, as they were last season, as Hülkenberg in particular was able to show that car could get into Q3, but just would terribly regress on race day. So the fact that they're able to not just hold position, but even move up is a real testament to the work that Haas have managed to do in the off-season and into the first race and the second race of the season. So a great drive from him, a number of really good passes, and even though he racked up enough penalties in the race to make Esteban Ocon from 2023 proud, it was the ultimate team drive and made sure that pretty much Hulk was able to score a point for Haas on the weekend. Bottas, -1. I mean, I wasn't really prioritizing him as a transfer last week because of the fact that Ricciardo was, in my eyes, probably close to must go, and he had a pretty miserable race on all accounts. It was a toss-up between Stroll and Ricciardo, and as is the case in fantasy, a lot of luck plays into some of how our results pan out. And I went with getting rid of Ricciardo, which he still scored less than Magnussen, but Ricciardo versus Stroll, I would have taken Ricciardo's score over Stroll's -17. So that's what it is. Can't do much about it now. And then Albon 6 points, RB 4 points. Absolute mess from RB. I've got to get them out for Australia. That's what's pretty much killing my rank this season. So that puts me at 380k overall out of almost 2 million. By no means the perfect start, if anything, an imperfect start to the season. But as I said last week, there's absolutely nothing wrong if you're well back in the pack like I am. Your team value is a little shot. It's not the end of the world. There's a very long season ahead of us. And as soon as the chips come into play from probably like race week 6 to 8 onwards, as was the case last season, we're going to see a lot of movement in the ranks. So I'm by no means worried. But again, it's also by no means a great start to the season. So a long season to left, and yeah, I guess just going to have to rebound in Australia. So we'll take a quick look at my team for Australia, and as is the case with these team selection videos every single race week, wait until practice rolls around to make those final decisions. But I feel like I already have a fairly good idea of what my team's going to look like for the third race of 2024, and a lot of that purely boils down to the fact that Red Bull and Ferrari are the two best teams in Formula One as it stands. A great result for Verstappen and Perez, back-to-back 1-2s in the first two races, and Charles has also picked up consecutive P3s for Ferrari. So it looks like the Ferrari is a much more consistent and reliable car than what we saw in 2023. And it's a really good sign that they're able to at least maintain that performance in consecutive races. It's a very much rocks and diamonds car from what we've seen the last couple of seasons. So if Charles is able to just kind of stick in and around that podium position or those podium positions, he's in with a really good shot of P2 in the drivers this season. But I think given the fact that Red Bull is by far the most dominant and Ferrari are clear number 2, I have to think of some way of getting Ferrari into my team. The 2 premium constructor option has looked like the very best fantasy combo through the first 2 races with a Perez or Leclerc or a Sainz as your DRS boost. Currently, Max is on that. And I was harping on about Max at the start of the season as a must-own 2 times in your team. And I still stand by that to a certain extent. I think he is the most reliable driver and is going to score the most fantasy points just about every single race week. I wouldn't be surprised if we see 90 to 95% of races Max is the top scorer this season. But it's become very evident in the last 2 races, partly because of the fact Perez has been driving so well, that Max is just not worth it at 30.4 million. If Perez's performance, which we thought at the start of the season would be fluctuating race to race, then I think that makes Max a more obvious 2 times driver in the team. But if Perez is going to continually get those P2s, those P3s, those P4s every single race week, and I've got Red Bull constructor in my team already, I'm essentially relying on Perez to score me those points for the constructor to do well. So it seems a little bit kind of counterintuitive to go for Red Bull Racing and obviously lean on Max to score most of those points. But if I really want to do well, I also need Perez to do well. So I'm of the thought that going into Australia, it's very likely Perez or Leclerc will come into my team in place of Max. And as a result, that would enable a bit more budget to upgrade the RB to a Ferrari. Now, as it stands right now, I'm a couple $1,000,000 short to get to Ferrari. They're just at 19.9, and there may be people who have a team similar to me that can make a move like this in 2 moves. I could have made that move last week, or I think I could have got Sainz and Ferrari in 2 moves last week, but I wanted to give it another week just to give myself 3 trades heading into Australia, and I still think I'm happy with that decision. I know I probably took a little bit of a hit again on my points in my rank in race week 2, but again, not the end of the world. I just wanted a bit more information to confidently inform that decision when we get to the 3rd race and the deadline in just under 2 weeks' time. So again, not able to move to Ferrari in 2 moves. The most likely moves or makeaways for me for Australia would be Stroll or Albon. As it stands right now, I think the Haas race pace, as I mentioned before, has looked much improved from where it was 12 months ago. And I could, with 3 trades, because I rolled one across from Saudi Arabia, bring in Ferrari and just have enough budget to also get Nico Hülkenberg at 6.7 million. So, that's not Nico Hülkenberg. That's Alex Albon. So that could potentially be my team in Australia. 2 Haas drivers worries me just a little bit. But at the same time, as I said before, they're able to hold station throughout an entire race and not suddenly lose 5 positions from where they qualified. So K-Mag and Hülkenberg have both driven very well. We'll just go over to f1fantasytools.com for a quick snapshot of how they've performed fantasy-wise through the first 2 races. K-Mag's averaged 7 points a race. That is, at his price, very good value. I did not expect that coming into this season. And if I told you at the start of the season I'd be running 2 Haas drivers within the first 3 races of the season, you've told me I've lost my marbles. So I can't believe I'm actually in this situation, but they've certainly shown, both with the car and the kind of team principle that's driving forward a lot of these initiatives and development with the car. It is a really good sign to see from the Haas team. So even though Hulk obviously had a slightly less than desirable performance in Bahrain, turned it around in Saudi Arabia, and K-Mag's consistency of 7 apiece in both races looks really good. So I'm quietly confident they're able to continue that form into Australia. If for whatever reason a double up on Haas scares me a little bit, and I'm not saying I'm ruling it out right now, but it may well be a possibility or a risk I'm not willing to take, is I stick with someone keep Alex Albon in the slot here, and I would, as a result of that, if I can find who I'm looking for, bring in potentially Esteban Ocon. Now, having an Alpine in my team terrifies me a little bit, I'll be honest. Calling the Alpine car at the moment washed is an insult to water and soap, and quite frankly, the Alpine has done nothing to inspire me that they're going to score points in the first half of this season whatsoever. In fact, I would go as far to say that they will be P9, P10 by season's end, given the car is 10 kilos overweight and just seems to be, 4 to 5 tenths off where they were 12 months ago. It's usually the inverse of that, but they seem to have made the car even worse, which I didn't know was humanly possible. But this could realistically be another build I'm looking at this weekend. I think partly because of the fact, though, that Ocon and Gasly's qualifying performances have been absolutely atrocious. And that, in a sense, means that they could realistically qualify anything from P17 to P20 most race weeks. The one thing that scares me is the reliability. And obviously, Gasly had that DNF in Saudi Arabia before it even made it through a couple of laps. That makes me think, based on what we saw from Ocon last year as well, that this could be a little bit of a risk that I'm taking. 7 DNFs Ocon had last year, and the fact that Gasly's already had 1 through 2 races, particularly because he didn't even make it through a couple of laps, concerns me a little bit. So I'm not jumping at Ocon in my team just yet, but I think his consistency, as we've seen through 2 races, primarily stems from the fact that the Alpine is qualifying dreadfully. It is far and away the worst car on the grid right now. So you're kind of playing the fantasy game here that you're hoping they qualify dead last and then they pick up a bunch of overtakes and positions gained from drivers that ultimately don't finish the race, like Stroll, for example, or Gasly. But that's kind of where my head's at potentially. Again, I'm kind of strong-armed a little bit with budget because I've been stuck on that RB basket case through the first couple races, which has crippled my budget a little bit. And then the Sauber and their pit stops are another story altogether. But I think the budget for my team is by no means amazing, but I think I could realistically fill my team up with a couple of these mid-price drivers that are just going to be consistent fantasy-wise. And I do know I want to go for Red Bull and Ferrari in Australia, and then I'll think about potentially a Perez or even maybe a Leclerc if Ferrari look very good. I think as well, if Behrman's still driving for Ferrari at this point, it's not going to scare me away at all. I was really impressed by his drive, and if Sainz is back, that's just an added bonus. So I'd have to really see something discouraging from Ferrari in Australia in practice to say no to them as the constructor this race. But again, we'll just have to wait and see. And as is the case with most races, it is quite circuit dependent. Now, obviously just drop Charles in there as my DRS boost, and that would mean I could keep Stroll. So I could realistically get to that team in 2 moves without having to go for Perez, have 1.1 left over to get rid of potentially Bottas, and then bring in someone like a Joe for overtakes. Obviously didn't have a great race in Saudi Arabia compared to his first race, but just seems to be a little bit more lively in the car than Valtteri. Just, I think, because he's got his neck on the line this season, whereas Valtteri may well do as well, but this guy's in the twilight of his career, whereas Joe is entering his prime, comparatively speaking. So I think potentially that could be a team as well, but I'd have to really be confident that Charles is going to take that car to the podium and potentially the race wins to go with a team like this. But again, that's kind of where my initial thoughts are at right now. I think the 2 premium constructor build is almost certainly the best build at the moment from what we've seen in 2 races. But if you have another opinion on that, if you think Max deserves to be in our teams and maybe a Red Bull Aston Martin Max combination should be the way moving forward, then let me know down in the comments below, because I've seen a lot of variety from teams in the first couple of races of the season, and it's really exciting to see so many of you with so many different opinions and builds in the comments on YouTube, on Twitter, engaging with me around what you think is the most optimal strategy moving forward. But this is kind of where my head's at initially. This probably will change a lot between now and the deadline. There's going to be a number of upgrades for teams coming into Australia and Japan and China. So that could really change my thought process heading into those races. But I'm quite content that the decision for Red Bull Ferrari will almost realistically be where I go heading into this race. Now, I've left out Mercedes and McLaren. I think there's maybe some discussion to be had in respect of both of those teams. But I think Mercedes is just a step or 2 off Ferrari right now, and McLaren, it seems as though they're bringing upgrades around kind of the 6th, 7th, 8th race of the season. So I wonder if, combine that with how dear their price is at the moment, there's probably more of an option for them a little bit down the line. But that's kind of where my head's at for now, guys. I'm going to park it there, pick things up again closer to the deadline with my race preview and final thoughts, and obviously all the content I do with the fantasy formula with Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ is over on FanAmp on their YouTube channel. So be sure to drop by there as well for more F1 fantasy content in the lead up to Australia. But I appreciate you guys dropping by as always. I'll catch you later, and I'll see you all very soon.